Hello. I would like to thank you all for being here today. There was many people, much more than I was expecting, so I really appreciate this. I would also like to extend a special welcome and thank you to Taryn and Catherine Thornsley, who will be joining me on stage in a bit. An art song is a poem that has been set to music. For the last 5 or 6 years, I have become increasingly interested in this relationship between poetry and music, especially in the fact that a performer of art song is interpreting a composer's musical interpretation of a poem. This is a different level of complexity than is found in other genres of classical music. This interest in art song led me to discover the fascinating songs of Nikolai Medtner, some of which we will share with you tonight. My primary aim with this presentation and my thesis is to provide future performers with a resource to aid in the interpretation of his songs, and therefore hopefully make his songs more approachable. Nikolai Medtner is a composer that not many of you are familiar with, unless you talk with me a lot, and then you're probably very familiar with it. He was born in Russia in 1880 and attended the prestigious Moscow Conservatory, studying composition under Sergei Taneyev, who had previously studied with Tchaikovsky. In his youth, he was a formidable pianist. He received the small gold medal from the Moscow Conservatory, which was the highest award they received. His piano teacher, Vasily Safonov, said that if a diamond medal existed, he would have won that as well. He also won the Rubinstein Prize when he graduated at the age of 20. So many were surprised when at the age of 23, he turned to composing professionally rather than the much more lucrative career of performing. However, his compositions began to be regarded very highly by colleagues and critics, with his good friend Rachmaninoff saying that Medtner is the greatest composer of our generation. Ernest Newman, who was a critic at the time, proclaimed that a musician more thoroughly skilled in the mere craft of composition could not be imagined. Medtner was unfazed by those who criticized his decision to turn to composing professionally. He was fueled by a strong sense of determination and stubbornness, which did occasionally give him hardships later in life, some of which will be discussed soon. He lived in Russia until well after the revolution. He did a concert tour once in North America, arranged by his good friend Rachmaninoff, and then settled down in London in 1936, where he lived the last 15 years of his life. His output was numerous, and all his compositions were written for piano. He wrote 14 piano sonatas, which was the most in this genre since Beethoven. He also wrote numerous short works for piano, 3 piano concerti, 3 violin sonatas, a piano quintet, 2 pieces for 2 pianos, and 108 art songs. Over 40 of these songs were from German poets, primarily Goethe, with 2 vocalises, and the rest from Russian poets, such as Pushkin, Tutchev, and Lermontov. Medtner had a special connection with poetry from a young age. His mother was a singer, and his father was a lover of poetry and literature, primarily Goethe. This devotion with Goethe and the Russian poets was passed down to Medtner and his older brother, Emil. Emil had probably the largest influence on Medtner's tastes, with a love of German culture, philosophy, and psychology. According to Medtner, and I quote, "So then, about Goethe, I have acquired a certain technique in reading verse. Earlier, I had lacked this technique to appreciate it, whereas now I see that there is a certain technique here as absolutely indispensable as musical technique is in reading notes. And now, when I opened Goethe, I went off my head with delight," end quote. And about his favorite Russian poet, he said, and I quote, "With Pushkin, you feel originality in everything," end quote. It is not just in his songs, though, that this affinity with poetry is evident. Before many of his other works, he printed poems to show his inspiration, many of which became songs themselves later. For example, in his piano sonata in E minor, it is preceded by Of What Do You Howl, Night Wind by Tutchev. Just a side note for any pianists out there, Medtner's biographer, Barry Martin, called this piano sonata perhaps the greatest piano sonata of the 20th century. Medtner was convinced of his musical calling to the point of religious conviction. As Robert Rimm states, and I quote, "Medtner felt musically chosen from the earliest years and saw it as his birthright to defend his immutable conception of art," end quote. He was faithful in his beliefs to the point of artistic obscurity and financial discomfort, and this affected him strongly in his later years. Medtner believed that the artist's role was to create lasting beauty. He held the act of musical creation to be sacred and considered it one of the highest forms of human activity. This seriousness towards his art was partially due to his upbringing. His inclination towards romantic language, both in music and in literature, caused him to become increasingly disconnected from the musical trends at the time. In a letter to his brother, he shows some of this frustration with this disconnect, and I quote, "Has it not crossed your mind that I was born too late, that what I write is not in tune with the times?" Medtner was looking backwards towards great Russian composers such as Beethoven, Bach, Schumann, while other composers of the time, such as Stravinsky, Prokofiev, Debussy, and many others, were looking forward in new directions. More than half a century of composing saw his style change very little. Critical reaction, however, differed wildly. Some thought of him as a great innovator, while others saw him as an arch conservative. Some felt he was the heir to the great Germanic tradition, while others spoke of his Russian soul and his ability to capture music in the atmosphere of Russia at the turn of the century. He considered himself a follower of Beethoven, and the best of his work reflects the great polyphonic skill, the detailed, short, compact motifs, and the severe spirit and concentrated depth of the late Beethoven piano sonatas. Medtner is responsible for many unique innovations in harmony, form, and especially rhythm. His music has an abundance of cyclic references, formal innovations, polyrhythms, metrical dissonance, and thematic transformations. Many of his piano sonatas and shorter works borrow from each other, occasionally using almost identical themes. For an extreme example, his main theme in his Reminiscenza piano sonata is exactly the same as the opening in another one of his shorter pieces, and yet identical still to another, except in the major key instead of the minor key. And a little correction on what I said. It wasn't just his piano music, it was all of his music. He would share themes from his art songs to his piano music to his violin sonatas throughout his entire genres. In his art songs specifically, Medtner pioneered the use of vocalization with humming and vowel sounds. In many songs, he would use it as a continuation of the text to convey a certain emotion that was being highlighted in the poem, such as sadness, mourning, joy, among others. Many of his songs have extensive piano interludes and piano postludes, in a sense carrying on Schumann's tradition. However, unlike Schumann's codas, which are essentially poetic, Beethoven's are more structural and gather together the threads of his argument. In 1835, Medtner wrote a treatise titled The Muse and the Fashion, being a defense of the foundations of art music, which was published and endorsed by Rachmaninoff. It is an impassioned, critical response to the direction he saw music heading at the time. A direction moving away from music rooted in tonality and traditional rhythmic and melodic structures. Medtner urged younger generations of composers to follow their muse and not to give in to the fashion of the times. It is essentially a 150-page protest against music that abandons the standard tonal system based on technical, fundamental, and philosophical arguments. I quote, "Errors of theory and of practice have been observed before, but no theories of error have ever been known to exist before now." End quote. In his treatise, Medtner explains that the primary role of the composer is to discover and not to create. He describes a divine song, which has existed since the beginning of all time, and which all great music comes from. He believed that all great music shared fundamental laws and defended them vigorously as his own deep personal beliefs. One of these primary fundamental laws of music for Medtner was this pull from complexity to simplicity, from dissonance to consonance. Medtner was not against extreme dissonance. In fact, he often welcomed it, but for him it had to be rooted in harmonic structure and eventually resolve into consonance. Before I move on to discussing the individual songs that I've chosen, I will briefly highlight my reasons for choosing them. I've chosen 8 songs in total to perform, the first 5 of which I will be analyzing in greater detail. I chose Wanderer's Nachtlied because through it, we can see Medtner's personal thoughts and struggles through his unique interpretation of Goethe's poem. It is a key example of how knowing the historical context in which a song is written can directly add to depth and meaning of the song. The other 4 songs are his Opus 45 set, and they have no connection to each other. One of the German traditions that Medtner did not take after was the idea of song cycles. Like Rachmaninoff, all of his songs are independent and do not have any connection to each other, and are generally grouped just by composer, and even then, not always. I have chosen these songs primarily because the poetry is not straightforward. They are complex both musically and in theme and meaning. One of my main priorities with this thesis is to provide a gateway for future performers to assist in the interpretation of his songs, which can be quite intimidating with no groundwork having been laid. Hopefully this will have the effect of making his songs more approachable and less daunting to future performers. I've also chosen them because there's very little written about them, save for at most a sentence or 2 in a handful of articles. The last 3 songs I performed tonight, I will not be discussing in detail, but I've chosen them to highlight specific things which I will talk about when I introduce them. Their thematic content is also more approachable and straightforward than the Opus 45 set. By the way, this picture of Medtner is the closest he comes to smiling in any photo. In 1906, while visiting his brother, Emil, and his wife, Anna, Medtner wrote a set of songs on Goethe's poetry and dedicated it to the 2 of them. The first song in the set is titled Wanderer's Nachtlied, and it is one of Goethe's most well-known poems. Over every mountaintop lies peace. In every treetop, you scarcely feel a breath of wind. The little birds are hushed in the woods. Wait, soon you too will be at peace. The song starts with a prolonged tonic chord in E-flat major, with a calm and peaceful atmosphere. There is a rocking, suspended feeling that pervades throughout the entire song. On the word peace, Ruhe in German, Medtner does the exact opposite of what one would expect, and he writes a dissonant German 6th chord with an accent, which resolves back into E-flat major. Medtner then repeats is peace over yet another dissonant chord, which again fades away into E-flat major. There is a long build-up through modulations and harmonies before arriving back home at E-flat with a fortissimo. The vocal line here is the only line in the song that is not pianissimo, and it is triple forte. The singer exclaims, "Only wait, Soon you too will be at peace. Once again, on the word soon, Medtner uses the dissonant chord that resolves back to E flat major. Only after the singer has cut off does Medtner instruct the pianist to diminuendo, which after a few bars of reaffirming the tonic, arrives back at the pianissimo that the song started with. Now, at first glance, the way Medtner set this piece does not seem to jive with the poetry. Why on the word peace would he write dissonant chords both times, and later on the word soon? Why did he make the ending so dramatic when the poetry, the feeling in the poetry, seemed to suggest otherwise? Well, let me tell you a story. In 1896, when he was 16 years old, Medtner met Anna Bretenshi through a school friend, and they soon became good friends and eventually developed feelings for each other. After his older brother Emil started taking her on dates, Medtner's mother, believing that his attachment to her was undesirable because he was 16 and she was over 2 years his senior, she forbid him from seeing her anymore. Emil and Anna married 4 years later, although she confessed to him that she could never be a proper wife to him, despite not revealing her deep feelings she still had for Medtner. Medtner finally saw her again the following year, and all the feelings that they had for each other came rushing back. They confessed their love to Emil, with Anna saying later in a letter, and I quote, "We told Emil everything with total frankness, and he was magnanimous and understanding, but he begged us out of consideration for his parents, particularly his mother, not to take any steps for the moment," end quote. Anna continued to play the role of loyal wife for the sake of Emil's career and their parents' feelings. And the relationship between Emil and Nikolai was somehow never strained, despite Nikolai saying later in life that he had done his brother a terrible wrong for which he would never be forgiven. In 1918, nearly 12 years later, after their mother died, Emil gave Nikolai permission to marry his wife, and somehow all three of them remained on good terms for the rest of their lives. Somehow, I don't know how. So now that we understand Medtner's feelings and emotions about the marriage of Anna and his brother Emil, we see that Medtner's setting actually makes perfect sense. Medtner is not at peace, which he communicates with the dissonant chord on the word peace. However, he is trying to be at peace and accept the situation, which is shown in the way he keeps coming back to the rolling E-flat major chords. After the build-up before the last two lines, he can't contain himself anymore. He could be speaking the last two lines to himself or to Anna, but with the dissonant chord on the word soon, it is evident that even if it is still painful, he believes that rest will soon be at hand for his heart. This idea is supported in the piano postlude with the familiar rocking motion taking us from the emotional high back down to the comfort of E-flat major. For these next 4 songs, I've had to simplify and reduce some of my research because I do not want to keep you here all night, so I just plan to cover some of the major points. Opus 45, number 1, is a Pushkin poem titled Elegy, and in my opinion, it is Medtner's greatest art song, despite some stiff competition. This song is unique in many ways, beginning with the time signature. Medtner marks it 2-2, but in addition, he adds 10-8 in brackets, which highlights the septuplet figure that never ceases throughout the entire song in the piano part. The first verse can be seen as an ode to poetry, highlighting the beautiful descriptions poetry provide of the afterlife. The piano supports this with meandering septuplets, providing lush harmonies along with a sense of wonder and discovery. The voice floats over top in duples, giving a feeling of breadth and expansiveness. In addition, the septuplet figure begins as a pickup and is slurred over the bar line, which results in a feeling of continuous forward momentum. The poem moves on to describe how poets generally depict the afterlife, and we can feel in the piano part that this is becoming something more important than what came before. The harmonies change more frequently, and the texture gets thicker in the piano. In bar 36, the poem describes the deceased spirits descending down from above to seek those on earth that they care for. Just a note here, not every single part of the music that I discuss will be on the slides, but when I mention bar numbers specifically, they will always be up there. The bar numbers are handwritten and on the left-hand side of each line. So the tempo slows as the spirits visit their sleeping loved ones. Medtner sets a beautiful melody in the vocal line as the singer describes the joys and contentment the spirits bring to others' dreams. It is filled with tenderness and longing, which Medtner achieves in 2 ways. The first way is by keeping the piano in groups of 5, the septuplet figure, while the voice is in 4 over top of it. And as well, he has the voice have rests on the downbeats as well. Medtner treats this stanza very intimately and with a lot of care, with meticulous markings of dolcissimo, molto tranquillo, largamento, espressivo, yet another dolcissimo, which ends with a molto ritenuto. Medtner was a very detailed composer who put frequent markings and directions in his score. The next stanza likens the spirits to guests at a party waiting for the others to arrive. They are already in their immortal life and are eagerly awaiting the moment when their loved ones will pass on and join them. Medtner portrays this eager anticipation by moving forward and marking appassionato. In bar 42, the left hand of the piano shifts to a full bar of sweeping arpeggios that continuously modulates and picks up intensity. This leads to a dramatic climax and shift in the tone at bar 58, which Medtner reaches through rapid modulations. We still have the 10-8 pulse. However, it is now a dotted rhythm, which contributes to the feeling of barreling forward into uncertainty. The tone is now one of uneasiness and almost danger. An important note here for performers to be careful of. Nearly every single recording I have discovered so far falls into a trap and distorts the rhythm. It gets turned into 6/8 by making the last 2 eighths of each septuplet feel like a duple. I will attempt to demonstrate it for you. So this is the way that Medtner wrote it and is intended to be. And the way it often gets distorted when it's performed is like this. Gets turned into a feeling of 4 rather than of 5. This undermines the effect that Medtner is trying to achieve by removing the rhythmic intensity, and unfortunately it ends up settling into a more relaxed affect. So at this point of the song, we aren't sure the reason for this dramatic shift until the next text from the singer explains that perhaps this is not what happens with the spirits. perhaps we lose all earthly feeling and will not be a part of this world anymore. While the volume eventually diminishes and the piano settles in the low register, Medtner makes it very clear not to slow down by writing sempre con moto. He puts this 3 times in the span of 6 bars. This next section highlights the genius of Medtner's writing. Pushkin's next stanza says, "But what if we become something more? Something that loses connection with the living world, but also becomes more glorious and beautiful than we can imagine." This is the image that Medtner is chasing. And he starts it off reminiscent of the beginning. However, like the previous iterations of the spirits, it has now evolved into something new. Beginning in bar 84, the left hand of the piano is in 3. The right hand is in 10, with an upper melody in 5, once again with the 5s overlapping the bar line, and the voice is singing in 2. The 5 versus 3 in the piano are playing the same melody, with it being augmented in the left hand. This rhythmic complexity creates a feeling of continuous overlapping waves with a delicate texture that builds for 22 bars, becoming richer and more expansive. Medtner expertly conveys the idea of becoming something greater than we are, something that is removed from reality here on earth. The last page of the song is an extended piano coda, winding down into the sonority of G major. Like the spirits, it becomes increasingly ethereal and fleeting, before rising and finishing in the heavens. Medtner makes sure to note that the pedal should continue to be held for long after the last note, letting the sound truly slip away from this realm. Just another note. If you are very observant, you might notice that sometimes when I am quoting a short phrase of the poem, it doesn't always have the same translation that I have up on the slide. This is because these slides are what is called a poetic translation, and the purpose of it is to preserve the rhyme and the overall sense of the poem, essentially becoming a poem itself in the new language. This is very useful, except when you want to know what individual words mean, which is important when learning art song. So I went through and translated each word in all the songs, and sometimes if I'm referencing something more specific, I might use that translation. I just felt that was worth mentioning. In Opus 45, number 2, The Cart of Life, Pushkin metaphorically likens a coach ride to our journey through life. According to A. Z. Foreman, this poem demonstrates Pushkin's ability to, and I quote, shift incongruously between the obscene and the sublime, end quote. There is an instance of profanity that is usually censored in Russian reprints, and when translated to other languages, the profanity is often removed, as well as a lot of the slang and colloquialisms. For this reason, it can be difficult to capture the nuances of the poem as Pushkin intended. Despite this, to me, this is the most straightforward poem of the Opus 45 set. While it does deal with the issue of our relentless journey through life and accepting death, it communicates very directly with the reader. Throughout the song, the piano depicts the cart ride, pushing on relentlessly, using syncopations and metrical dissonances as bumps in the road. At the beginning, he marks, always at tempo and very rhythmic, and makes several references throughout to maintain the tempo. This is the only song of this set where Medtner does not ask for very much pedal or use very many expressive markings. He writes many staccatos, accents, and tenutos to get the precise energy that he is looking for. This song is in 3 sections. The first section is when the narrator is young. Second section is when the narrator is middle-aged. And the third section is when the narrator is nearing the end of his journey. Under the opening vocal line, the piano has offbeat 16th notes, which feel like rough, uneven bumps in the road. In bar 8, Medtner highlights the word time with an upwards syncopating melisma, signifying that time is driving this coach. Time continues to move on regardless of what goes on under or around it. In the beginning, we are eager to get on with our journey, and we do not want to waste any time. Bar 15 translates to, we shout, go on all three. However, Pushkin's original translates quite directly to, we cry, move it, mother expletive. And then, and then later, softened slightly to, we yell, get going for expletive's sake. I was going to say it, but then my family's here tonight, so I'll pass on that one. So, one of the reasons for Pushkin's vulgarity is because he is juxtaposing this line with the word lien from the previous bar. Excuse my Russian. This is a sensuous word that is very difficult to translate into English, but approximates to something like soft delights, with a little bit of a negative connotation. Now, this may seem like more information than is necessary for performing this song, but it is important in highlighting the nuance and complexity of Pushkin's poetry that an English translation does not give us. There is a deliberate reason for Pushkin's uses of crude slang and vulgarity. Medtner uses the censored version in his setting, but he still acknowledges the intention by writing a crescendo to an upward leap on the exclamation before arriving at a forte cadence. The poem shifts to midday now, and the music makes its first noticeable shift in tone. Medtner marks tenebroso, which means darkly, while reminding us not to lose tempo. And the opening vocal line shifts to the bass of the piano with an ascending chromatic figure on top. It is very rhythmic, but it has lost some of its bite. This agrees with the vocal line, which admits, we have no more of that courage, It has shaken us. The rising chromatics give the music a threatening feel and imply a sense of foreboding. The passengers in the cart shout to the coachmaster, "Take it easy, fool." The bumpy cart ride continues on. Into evening, traveling at the same pace, but now it's smoother and more subdued. The harmonic rhythm is much slower as well. The vocal line enters with the original figure from bar 3, except this time the note values are doubled in length. This portrays the more relaxed pace of evening and the weariness of the travelers who have perhaps now accepted their fate by saying, "We are accustomed to it." The next vocal line says, "And napping, we drive," and is stretched even farther still. Compare this melody here with the melody from the opening, which I will show you again. Especially take a look at the note durations, especially in the last bar on the melisma, and then this is what he does at the end of the song. Nearly identical notes, however, all the values have been doubled, and then farther on he even goes to triple them. The time signature then changes to a highly unusual 3-1. And the vocal line continues to wind down with even slower durations as the murmuring in the piano descends lower and lower in register. The piano finally stops before the final 2 chords, which are reminiscent of the ending of Schubert's Erlkönig. It is difficult to imagine that this was not intentional, as Medtner would have been quite familiar with Goethe's poem, and of course also Schubert's rendition of it. It is in the same key, the same register, and has the same thematic meaning, which would have been most important to Medtner. Those traveling in the cart of life have passed on. In the beginning of our life, we are eager and impatient and are always looking forward to the next adventure. There comes a point where life begins to pass us by, and we feel that we are traveling too fast to accomplish all the things we want to do. Near the end of life, there is often, hopefully, an acceptance, an understanding that our journey is coming to an end as we drift off and leave the world. This is the cart of life. this poem called Night Song by Tutchev. It is the most descriptive and metaphorical poem of the Opus 45 set. It describes our nightly dreams as a vast, expansive ocean. Medtner sets it in the unusual key of C sharp major, which I'm going to be honest is not my favorite key to play. In the piano introduction, Medtner sets the right hand melody in duples over a slow waltz in the left hand. There is an expansiveness that is meant to parallel the poem's subject matter, but the end of the introduction, an agitation and unsettled feeling creeps in. The voice enters and takes over the melody that was in the piano introduction, with the piano now playing pulsating triplet chords underneath. This results in the ideal affect for the opening line, which says, "The ocean envelops all earthly life surrounded by dreams." In this song, Medtner uses the piano primarily to create waves and carry the voice along like the boat in the waves of the unending ocean. This slide is 4 different ways that Medtner writes wave-like motion in the piano. On the words swelling with tide upsurging, he uses the upper left figure in the piano and pushes the tempo forward to mirror the urgency in the poem. Medtner then sets a yearning counter-melody to depict Night's voice calling us forth. Once we have heeded Night's call, we start off on our journey with a marking of più mosso. The piano again returns to waves, except this time they are all 16th notes, creating more motion. This can be seen in the bottom left image. We reach the line. The tide rises and quickly carries us into the immeasurability of dark waves, which Medtner depicts with a sempre più agitato, accelerando e crescendo, followed by agitato, and then again barreling forward with sempre più mosso, signifying that we are no longer in control anymore. There is suddenly a brief pause before bar 31, and Medtner sets an upward rising cry in the vocal line, which is held for 9 full measures. There are no words in this part. Medtner is using vocalization to convey a specific type of emotion that we have been building for the last page. The piano part has a quasi-cadenza with the repeating 1-bar figures that rise upwards while continuing to move forward. In this piano interlude, Medtner works with rhythm in a unique way. He specifically mentions that the pianist should accelerate to 3 times the speed as compared to the previous section. So now a dotted quarter note is the same duration as an 8th note previously. He then has the left hand play in quarters, creating a hemiolic rhythm. The voice unexpectedly joins in with these chords with the theme from the very beginning of the song. In bar 47, we return to the original tempo, and Medtner marks that the dotted half note now equals the quarter note. When the tempo changes back, the previous quarter notes have the same pulse as the triplet 8th notes in the new tempo, resulting in no perceptible change in meter or tempo in the vocal line. I'll try my best to demonstrate that for you. 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3. And now we're exactly back where we started. All my practicing in the bathroom mirror paid off. Okay. The opening melody after that repeats, but on the words "mysteriously from the depths," we unexpectedly arrive at a deceptive cadence. The rolling arpeggios in the bottom right of this slide depict the depths of the ocean waves, much fuller and deeper than in the beginning, and they get more agitated as Medtner marks poco a poco appassionato. This begins the drive to the final climax, which arrives in an expansive blaze of glory. As the tempo moves forward, Medtner has the vocal line sing longer notes, riding over top of the momentum in the piano. The text reads, "From all sides surrounded by an abyss." And this is when Medtner finally broadens. The arpeggios cease in the piano part, for we are no longer in or on water. We have moved on to something or somewhere else entirely. The rhythmic dissonance of chords in 2/3 meter returns and propels us to what we expect to be a final C-sharp major chord. However, Medtner instead arrives at a deceptive augmented chord which resolves to C-sharp major before moving through a new chord every bar, while the singer is still maintaining the high augmented note. The tumultuous piano postlude brings the final line of poetry to life by surrounding us rapidly in modulating harmonies, finishing in a fiery series of thundering octaves that bring us to a glorious conclusion. This poem by Tuchev, titled Our Age, is about how man rejects faith even when he needs it most. Medtner's dramatic setting brings an immediacy to the text and highlights the desperation of mankind. Medtner has the singer begin humming over a chorale-like series of chords in the piano. Medtner's unprecedented use of vocalises in his songs was always a deliberate attempt to convey the text and intention of the poetry. In this song, he uses vocalization to emphasize the fact that mankind is silent and won't utter the words that he needs to be saved. Verse 1, 'Tis not our flesh nowadays that is weak. The soul is soft, man desperately yearning. He craves the light, and for the light would seek, but finding it, rejects it undiscerning. The majority of the song has a 2-against-3 rhythm in the piano, which is somewhat of a common theme in Medtner's writing. This causes an unsettled feeling. There is a lack of grounding in the music that mirrors the poem. After the dramatic opening line, ending with desperately yearning, the short piano interlude softens the intensity, and we can feel a sense of yearning in bar 29 as the pitch rises but doesn't quite find stable ground. In bar 36, we unexpectedly arrive at E major on the word light, before moving past it and descending into a longer piano interlude. Medtner illustrates the text perfectly with this line by moving through harmonies rapidly before arriving at E major, which is the light that we have been seeking. However, we move past it and descend into a muddle of diminished seventh chords, with the melody being passed off between the voices. Verse 2. His lack of faith has scorched and dried his soul. Unending woe he bears in desolation. He senses doom with faith, the longed-for goal, for which he will not pray in supplication. This next verse of poetry portrays the despair and desolation of the soul without faith that man needs. In bar 48, the duples in the right hand are displaced and are often missing the downbeat, and the left hand is also missing some of the triplets that are on the strong pulse. This leads to an ungrounded and rhythmically unsettled feeling, as we aren't quite sure where the beat is or where we are going. Medtner is showing us that something is missing, something that we need to feel grounded. At the end of this verse, Medtner reaches a rhythmically unsettled climax, and the text comes across almost bitterly. Verse 3, and never will he say, in prayers and tears, no matter how he mourns outside the portal, I do believe, oh help my faith in thee, to open wide the gate to life immortal. Oh let me in. Despite often focusing on connecting music and text with a large-scale and broad approach, Medtner also uses some subtle word painting. For example, on the word prayers, Medtner outlines a consonant G major chord, and right after it on the word tears, he uses the pained interval of a diminished seventh. From the last line of this poetry, we can assume that the poet Tutchev intended to paint a picture of despair at the stubbornness and ignorance of man, and not one of hope. There are no happy endings here. However, I don't necessarily believe that Medtner felt the same way, or at least he decided not to portray it that way. It is a distinct shift in the feel of the music, beginning with, I do believe. The rhythm and the texture stay the same, but gone are the modulating chromatic harmonies. We begin building over a quasi-C major ostinato in the left hand that broadens and builds into something grand and wondrous, while for the first time in the whole song, the piano starts to double the voice part. We're finally in unison. There is a relentless, repeated 4/7-1 chord progression at the top of this slide, and it takes on the image of one incessantly beating at the gates before dramatically giving way to the opening E minor chorale theme in the piano. This time, however, instead of humming, the voice sings a fortissimo, "Oh, let me in." What was once mute has now found its voice. Even though for Tutchev, man's stubbornness and pride keep him from speaking these words, Medtner winds down the song and ends with an unexpectedly hopeful E major chord, perhaps signifying his belief that even in our final moments, it is never too late to turn to God. The next song I have chosen to perform is Arion, set to a poem by Pushkin. This song highlights one of the unique ways that Medtner uses vocalization in his songs as well. Pushkin's poem is based on the legend of the poet and musician Arion as he traveled by ship for a music competition. The sailors were jealous of his wealth and plotted to kill him, but Arion discovered their plan and asked to sing them a song first. He sang a song dedicated to Apollo, the god of poetry, and then leapt in the water to escape them. He was saved and carried to safety by a dolphin who was transfixed by the song. This is what the image on the slide is representing. Pushkin, however, had a slightly different take on the myth, and instead, a storm crashes the ship, and Arion survives to dry in the sun and continue to sing. Like with Tutchev's Night Song, Medtner uses the piano to represent the waves of the ocean, starting out calm and then building into the storm. He uses vocalization to show Arion singing to the sailors, and the vocalization returns for the entire last 2 pages of the song, as Arion is drying his clothes in the sun, joyful and happy to be alive. The next song is one of Medtner's most frequently performed songs, if indeed he has the most frequently performed song. It is also based on a poem of Pushkin called Winter Evening. In 1825, Pushkin spent all winter in a very small village in a small house, more of a shack, really, with only his former nanny for company. And this was one of the many poems that he wrote during that time. In this song, Medtner captures the essence of being in the countryside in the middle of winter. You hear the wind and snow continuously swirling and finding the cracks of the house, and you feel the anxiety and the repetitive nature of having to be indoors constantly by the fire for warmth. There is a reprieve in the middle section when they turn to drinking and forget their sadness and think of springtime. The frenetic pace of the wind and snow returns before being drowned out once again at the end by wine and thoughts of springtime. It is, if I may say so, a very Russian song.
Oh,
The great Canadian pianist Marc-André Emelin said, and I quote, "I think one of the reasons that Medtner hasn't had a chance is that his music needs very, very committed performances. If you play his works passively, the juice is not going to come out," end quote. This made me think of Taryn and Catherine, who always give very, very committed performances of Medtner's work. They certainly brought the juice out tonight. So I'm very lucky to be able to work with them. I just have a few final remarks before the last song. Sometimes when I read musical analysis, I think, did the composer really think that? Are they just overanalyzing every little detail and giving meaning to something that isn't actually there? And actually, I think that's a fair thought to have, and is sometimes the case. However, with Medtner, I do not feel that way. The amount of detail he puts in his scores, the seriousness with which he took his craft, and the way he defended it so vigorously when it came under attack tells me that I am probably just scratching the surface of what Medtner was actually intending. Rather than starting from the music, my aim was to approach his songs while using the poetry as the starting point, since that is how Medtner composed them. Once the singer and the pianist tackle and understand the details of the poetry together, the complexities melt away, and they're left with more of a whole rather than fragments. The best way to get Medtner's songs recognized and performed as part of the art song canon, aside from actually playing them, is to bring them to discussion and to write about them. For other composers, there are numerous books that go through song by song in detail, no matter how simple. How can we expect Medtner to compete with that? There is nothing out there, and it is his songs that need it most, in my opinion. Though theory and history have not been the bulk of my doctoral degree, this is the beginning of my contribution to academia in the hope that Medtner will be recognized for the superb composer that he is. I believe this will be beneficial to future pianists and singers alike to use as a guide for approaching these songs. His music demands careful attention and thought, but gives great rewards for those who invest in it. Okay, I'll get off my soapbox now. The last song we will be performing for you tonight contained special significance to Medtner as it captures the essence of his whole musical aesthetic. Medtner quotes this poem in full before the first chapter of his treatise, The Muse and the Fashion, the poem being named The Muse. The poem describes how the Muse teaches a musician his work, which was of philosophical interest to Medtner. It starts simply and then gradually increases in complexity and intensity, with Medtner introducing a theme that he used to convey the spiritual or the higher realm. He also uses this same theme in his Sonata Ballade and in his piano quintet to signify the same thing. From this point, the music moves towards a rapturous climax, celebrating the joy of creation as the Muse joins in and plays her music.